Welcome, everybody. I can't see all of your faces, but I know that there are 85 people here in the Zoom, and I'm ready to get started. My name is Shannon Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Lincoln County Historical Association. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us this evening for this installment of our 2024 online winter lecture series. I'm very excited to be welcoming speaker Jody Bachelder. She'll be speaking about Samoset of Pemaquid. I would like to thank our sponsor, J. Edward Knight and Company Insurance. Because of their help, we're able to offer this lecture free to the public. And I can tell you that it makes a difference. Every donation makes a difference. Their sponsorship is so important to allowing this to take place tonight. And all of those of you who've sent in a donation tonight, I want you to know that those donations have made a difference too. And we really appreciate that. One thing I want to say before we get going any further is we're having quite a lot of wind this evening, and Jody and I, when we were preparing, we were getting ready on the Zoom before you all came in, we had a few tech issues, and I want you to know now, if we do have issues during the meeting where audio or video drops out or something and we have to stop the presentation early or something, then I will reach out to you afterwards about any reschedules. I don't anticipate that will happen. I want to be prepared in the event that it does. As I mentioned, that this is one lecture in a series of many lectures we're offering this winter. Next Thursday, we are bringing speaker Andy Volpe, and he will be talking to us about the print work of Paul Revere and his contemporaries. We've become interested in this early American print work after reproducing our 1772 cookbook last summer and discovering that it had some of Paul Revere's art in it. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with you next week. Please go ahead and sign up just in the same way you signed up for this talk. For tonight's lecture, I will ask everybody to remain on mute. I love it if you keep your camera on so I can see you, but that part's not necessary. Mute is necessary so that we don't have a lot of background noise. So I do ask you to stay on mute. You should have a little icon of a microphone in your lower left corner that you can click on and off from mute. You can go ahead and keep that off. And as questions arise, we welcome questions and look forward to your questions. You can type those right in the chat. And you can find chat at the bottom of your screen where you can share any questions with me. At the end of the talk, I will read your questions aloud. I'm actually having to mute somebody right now. At the end of the talk, I will read your questions aloud to Jody, and we will have a give and take in that way. I look forward to that at the end. Last thing, many people have asked, yes, we are recording this lecture, and as long as it goes well, technically I will have it posted on YouTube, available for viewing in the next few days. And if you registered for this lecture, as you all did, you'll automatically get an email letting you know when that's available. All right, should we get on to this evening? I think we should. I have the pleasure finally of introducing Jody Bachelder. Jody grew up on the Pemaquid Peninsula in Maine. This is where Samoset lived, and she found growing up that she knew little about the indigenous people who had called that area home for thousands of years, but later became interested in Samoset's story. Armed with the education and experiences of a librarian, and I did talk to someone yesterday who knew Jody as a librarian in their high school and said all great things about Jody's librarian awesomeness. Jody used those skills to learn more about Samoset, resulting in a book called Here First, which was published in 2022 and tells these stories that she discovered in her research. When I reached out to Jody about offering this presentation, she did hesitate at first, indicating she'd already given several presentations in the area, and she was a little bit worried that there might not be more people who are interested, but I can tell you that tonight we have about 250 people, 215 people who either registered for this talk or asked for access to the recording afterwards. And so I think that we can feel assured that there's plenty of interest in the story that Jody has to tell tonight. All right, with that said, I would like to pass things off to Jody. And I'll put myself on mute, looking for all of your questions throughout the talk and moving on. Thank you, Jody. We're really happy to have you here. Welcome.
Shannon, is the sound working? Are we working?
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Terrific. Thanks for having me. It's so nice to be here. Thank you to all who came. As she said, I've given this talk a few times, and it's always exciting to see that people are interested in this history of the Samoset. So I'm really pleased about that. And this quote is about Samoset walking into Plymouth Plantation, which of course is the thing he's most famous for. And I'm going to talk about all this in the future, but I like the fact that they described him as being very bold when he walked in, which is just one of his many wonderful characteristics. And you're going to see that there's just so much more to Samoset's life than just that walk into Plymouth. This talk takes me a little more than an hour, and I'm sorry for the amount of time that it takes, but there's a lot to cover, and I go through it pretty fast. So buckle your seatbelts, and we'll get started. But first, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. If you're in Maine right now, then you are on the ancestral homeland of the Wawenock. I'm going to be talking mostly about Pemaquid, and that is the ancestral homeland of the Wawenock. So it's appropriate that we recognize that Indigenous people have lived here for many, many thousands of years, taking care of the land and the waters here, and to acknowledge that they're still here. So I don't need to go into really my background because Shannon has done that, and with her media blitz, you know everything about me. But I do want to mention a couple of things, and one is I'm not a historian. I am a librarian by training. I'm just a person who loves history. And I found this story just so fascinating. It took hold of me, and it just blew up and became what I thought was going to be a picture book for kids ended up being a history book for adults. So go figure. The other thing I want to make sure that you recognize is I am not Indigenous, and this is an Indigenous story. So I recognize that I may not be the best person to tell Samoset's story or the Wawenock story. It would be better if it could be told by a Wawenock person. We'll see over the course of this that the Wawenock are not in the area anymore, but maybe someday they will. They will tell this story, and I hope that will happen. I just want to say too, it was important for me to try to just correct mistakes that I had seen about Samoset. So I want, if you Google Samoset, you will read that he was kidnapped and taken to England, and sometimes they confuse him with Squanto. Both of those things are inaccurate. So I was hoping I could at least set the historical record straight as far as I could do that. And finally, it was really important for me, because I'm not Indigenous, to have Indigenous people read the manuscript. There's just so much that as a non-native person I can't possibly know. So I did ask a couple of Wabanaki historians to read it, and that was great. I'm so grateful for their help. And I think the book came out a little bit better thanks to their help. So I like to start with a map. This is a map of Wabanaki territory. And as you can see, it was a large territory in the Northeast. You probably know that the word Wabanaki translated into English means the Dawnland, or, where the sun rises. So the people in the Dawnland are the Micmac, and they lived in the Canadian Maritimes and had a really large territory. And then there were the Maliseet along the St. John River, and their territory now spans both Canada and Maine. Then there are the Passamaquoddy in down East Maine, and the Penobscot. And then by this map, and hopefully you can see, there are a lot of other tribes west of Penobscot territory. And those have been collectively referred to as the Abenaki. And there were many smaller tribes within this part of Wabanaki country. The Wawenock were just one of those tribes. So I think that the word Abenaki is sort of the French pronunciation of Wabanaki, and that's where that comes from, as far as I can understand. So if we drill down a little bit and look at Wawenock homelands, you'll see that it's in the mid-coast area from about the Kennebec River on its west side to about the St. George River. So you can see that that it's a coastal territory. So the ocean rivers were very important to the Wawenock. In fact, we think Wawenock, the term Wawenock means people of the Bay Country. So you can see by the geography that makes perfect sense. So Samoset lived in Pemaquid, which on this map is number 15. He lived on the end of that peninsula. And there would have been many Wawenock bands within the Wawenock homelands. Pemaquid was just one of the villages. There would have been one in Damariscotta and Wiscasset and Sheepskid, and probably many, many more. These were not large villages. We think there were about 100 people living in Pemaquid and Samoset's time, and that was probably pretty typical. And throughout what we now call the state of Maine, about 5,000 indigenous people, although it's really hard to know that with any certainty. So I want to take a look at what Samoset's life would have looked at in his early years, because we think that it was probably about 15 years before he even met Europeans. Nobody really knows when he was born, but again, if you Google him, you'll see a birth date of 1590, which I think is just an estimate of him being about 30 years old when he walked into Plymouth, which is probably somewhat accurate. So if that's the case, then he would have been about 15 when he met English people for the first time. So how did the Wawenock live before contact? They were mostly hunter-gatherers and fishermen. They may have been farming in Pemaquid. This was the Little Ice Age 400 years ago, so it was colder in Maine than it is now. So, agriculture was a bit tricky, and the Wawenock lived right about at the cusp of where it was possible to grow crops reliably. But there was an archaeological dig done at Pemaquid, and they did find charred corn that dates back to the 1400s. So it appears that they were eating corn. If they weren't able to grow it, then they were trading for it with their southern neighbors who could grow it. So their lives would have revolved around the seasons and where they could obtain their food, of course. In the spring, we'd find Samoset at Pemaquid. But when the alewives and the salmon would start running up the rivers, then you would find all Wabanaki congregating on rivers, probably near a waterfall where those alewives and salmon would also congregate. It seems like it was a real social time. People were coming together from different villages. It was a chance to be together with your family and friends, as well as, get a lot of food there, because, there were so many alewives and salmon at that time that they could just scoop them up in baskets, and they were smoking them to preserve them for future eating. Then in the summer, they would go back to their regular village, and they were eating, clams and mussels and all kinds of shellfish, fishing for other types of fish. And they were getting also food from the sea. They were hunting for seals and porpoises, and almost unbelievably, they were hunting for whales too. We have an account in an English journal where they describe Wabanaki men hunting in their birch bark canoes, hunting whales with spears and bows and arrows, which to me is, pretty impressive. So then fall would come, and they're stockpiling a lot of food at that point. I mean, they have picked berries in the summer, and they would dry some. If they are farming, they're going to try to preserve some of that food, dry the corn. And they're also going to forage for nuts and things like that. The men are going to hunt a lot, so that they've got food stores to bring with them for their winter camp. And winter camp would have been not at Pemaquid, believe it or not. They were kind of reverse snowbirds. They would apparently head inland because the hunting would be better there. They were hunting for moose and deer, big game. They'd be trapping beaver, probably doing some ice fishing, so they would have been near a water source. And apparently they would also disperse into smaller groups. They wouldn't be all together, 100 of them together, because as hunter-gatherers, they all need their own territories to hunt in. So hopefully you get to see what the rhythm of their lives look like. They were moving to take advantage of the food sources. It was a really healthy diet that they were eating, very active lifestyle. They spent a lot of time with family and friends. They were very social. They had an intimate connection with the land and with the animals on the land. They understood how everything worked, and they lived really sustainably. And this is important because, in indigenous culture, they always thought to the future generations, don't take more from Mother Earth than she can give you, so that there's enough for generations to come. So I think of their world as being really in balance. And then the Europeans came. And very quickly, their world is going to get out of balance. But it appears that the Samoset probably met English people for the first time in 1605. There was an English sea captain named George Weymouth who came to Muscongas Bay. And on the left, you can see the map. There's Pemaquid. Muscongas Bay is to the east of that. And then there's a group of islands called the Georges Islands. And I've marked that by Allen Island because that's the largest one. And so George Weymouth was here looking for resources that he could sell off at home, but he was also looking for a place to build a colony. And we know this because it's documented in a book that was published. One of the men on the expedition, whose name was James Rosier, wrote notes and wrote this down in a book. And you can read that book today. And it's absolutely wonderful that we can. And it's actually a really good book to read. So now, as I said, Samoset's probably about 15 years old. So he's, nearly an adult at this point. So their first interaction, which will take place about 11 days after Weymouth drops anchor at Allen Island. And I think the reason why it takes them so long is because I think they are probably sounding the alarm up and down the coast when they see this strange ship sail into that bay. They are probably alerting all the other tribes up and down the coast. And then once they have done that, then they go out and make contact. And we know some things about these first meetings because Rosier writes about them. And it's kind of fascinating to me. He includes some of the details. 3 men paddle out to the ship and try to make contact. Of course, they don't speak each other's language, but Rosier, it's part of their mission. They want to make contact with the native people. So he tosses a bundle of gifts down into their canoe, peacock feathers and rings and clay pipes. And they're really excited by the peacock feathers, which are so beautiful. They put them in their hair. And I think they're really excited about the fact that these foreign people mean to be friendly. And Rosier will, and they'll get together on shore and they will do some trading with one another, and they will smoke some tobacco together and share some meals. So everything is kind of going along very well. And Rosier shares some details with us. He gives them some sugar candy, which they love because they don't have sugar in their diet. He gives them some alcohol, which they detest and they spit out, interestingly. I love the detail that he gives them a mirror to see their reflections, and they just laugh and laugh and laugh. I can just so picture Samoset as a 15-year-old boy, he and his friends, making faces at themselves in a mirror and just getting laughing it up. It's a great image. He mentions their clothing, and he talks about them wearing furs and skins, but also the fact that they make their clothing in separate pieces. So they wear belts that they can tie leggings to, and a tunic that they can tie sleeves to, and then they can take those off as they get too warm. I thought that was really clever. They used a lobster claw to smoke their tobacco. And he mentions how fascinated they are by handwriting, because this is the first time they have seen writing. It didn't exist in their culture. And they recognize that when he makes these scratches on paper, it helps him remember the words that they're telling him. So they all quickly run around and grab different things to give to him to watch him write those down on the paper. So having told us all these things, he then mentions that they're a people of exceeding good invention, and they're clever, they're inventive, and they're smart. But in his book, in the very next breath, he will refer to them as savages, which is certainly standard practice at the time. And it's meant to dehumanize indigenous people. I mean, Europeans would do that. All Europeans would do that, with the idea that in order for them to go out and build these empires that they wanted to build, they needed to dehumanize these people first. And so that term savages will be used over and over. And they will be treated that way too. So as I said, they shared some meals, they're getting along, they're getting to know each other over several days. I think is what would make the kidnapping all that much more of a betrayal and shocking to them, because that's what happens next. And it was part of their plan from the very beginning. The English planned to bring some of these people home with them. That was part of their mission. And this is not at all unusual among early explorers. If you read accounts, you will often see that they bring, that they'll kidnap people and bring them back to Europe. One Now, why did they do that? A lot of times they were just selling them off as slaves to make money. Sometimes it was just as a curiosity. I don't think that these Wawenock men were meant to be slaves ever, because Weymouth liked what he saw in Maine. You know, he saw that this was going to be a great place to build a colony. Of course it is. We have all the resources anybody could ever need. So his plan is to come back to this area, and he's going to need interpreters and guides to help him with his mission. So Rosier tells us their names. So we know that the 5 men were Tahanado, Amoret, Skikaweros, Manado, and Sastakowit. He also tells us that Tahanado was the sagamore of Pemaquid, so he was their leader. So they got a big prize, and they were targeting people specifically, the ones that they wanted to bring back. Now it's interesting, when this kidnapping happened on Allen Island, one of the 6 men in that scenario gets suspicious and runs off and hides in the woods. And I always like to think, was that Samoset by any chance? You know, we have no idea if it was, but it's possible. He could have been there. He was, you know, he was old enough to be considered a near adult. So that's kind of fun to think about. Now, I took this picture on Allen Island, and I just have to say, I'm not at all surprised that there's a monument to Weymouth on the island and no mention of the indigenous people. This was erected in 1905, which was a time in our history when we were really glorifying white colonization, and we were basically erasing indigenous people and their culture. This is a time when we're putting indigenous people in boarding schools. Maybe someday there'll be a monument out there to the 5 Wawenock men who were kidnapped. I don't know. But it's interesting that in New Harbor, there is a monument that was erected the very same year, 1905, to Samoset. It was meant to honor Samoset, but it really doesn't. It mentions his walk into Plymouth, and then it really glorifies the white colonists who supposedly purchased the Pemaquid Peninsula from Samoset. So again, it's kind of an erasure of his life. So we're working on that. We're working on adding to that narrative and giving a fuller picture of his life. So those 5 captives were carried across the sea, taken to England. They were split up. 3 of them were left on the west coast in Plymouth, and 2 were taken on to London. Now, this is an illustration of London at that time, which, as you can see, is a large, thriving city. There were about 250,000 people living in London at the time. And I try to equate what it must have been like for the Wawenock men to see this. I mean, it's kind of like me being dropped on Mars and seeing that there's a thriving human society there. I mean, they just saw things that didn't exist in their world. Tall buildings like this, that's St. Paul's Cathedral under construction, bridges that spanned a river. They didn't have these things. There were lots of technologies that they would have seen that didn't exist in their world too. And animals. There were animals like horses and cows and sheep and pigs and goats. Those animals didn't exist in the Americas, not indigenous to America. So that would have been such a surprise to them. So they would have seen sort of these wondrous things. But on the other hand, I have to point out that they would have seen things not so wonderful too. They would have seen poverty, which didn't really exist in their culture. They shared all of their resources amongst everyone. Whereas in London, you had the monarchy and you had noblemen and you had maybe a merchant class, and then you had a lot of poor people. And as a result, they would have seen probably a lot of pollution. They tended to throw their sewage right into the street, which then flowed right into the river. And as a result of that, there was a lot of disease. So those things really didn't exist in their world either. So they're seeing the good and the bad of their captors. And they're learning a lot. They're learning who are these people? What are their strengths and weaknesses? Maybe what are their intentions? And they'll bring that knowledge back to them, because 2 of the 5 men will make it back to Pemaquid. And they'll bring that knowledge with them. And they're brought back to help start an English colony. And this will be the Popham Colony, which you may have heard of. But I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't, because the history books kind of overlook the Popham Colony, even though it was also started in 1607, same year as Jamestown. Yet because it didn't succeed and Jamestown did, we kind of overlook it. We kind of forget about it. But it was really a big deal at the time. And it was amazing to me to find out that the Wawenock were so intimately involved with the Popham Colony. I had no idea. But because of the kidnapping, they were the ones that were involved with the colony. It's called the Popham Colony because it was named for Sir John Popham, who really gave most of the money, backed it financially. They had chosen for their location the mouth of the Kennebec River. They had done some scouting in 1606 and decided this was a great place. It didn't turn out to be a great place. It's on a nice big river. And it's near Popham Beach. You can visit this location. If you've ever been there in June, though, you know you'll be carried away by mosquitoes. It's really miserable. And it's up on a bluff, and it was really frigid and a lot of wind. So, I mean, those were not ideal. It's not an ideal location in the end. This is what the colony would have looked like, though. They were really planning on building a fortified settlement with walls around it and cannons. They were concerned about the French because the French were colonizing in Canada and in eastern Maine, which would be called Acadia. Those would be French settlements. So the English and the French, they're always at war, so they are concerned about the French. They try to build lots of buildings. They try to start a garden, but they don't arrive until August. So they're not going to get any food from that garden, which will be a problem for them. And then I want to point out in the lower right-hand corner, the ship that's under construction. That's the Virginia. And that was part of the mission, was to prove to themselves and to the world that they could build ships here. Because they came from a small island where they had really cut down most of their timber. And they didn't really have the timber resources to be building a fleet of ships. And, you know, Maine is covered with trees. It's the perfect place. So they brought with them Digby, a shipbuilder from London, purposefully to build a ship. And you can see a reconstruction of that ship because there is a volunteer organization called Maine's First Ship in Bath, and they have built a reconstruction of Virginia. And you can see it docked. In the winter, it's in Wiscasset, but in the summer, it's in Bath, and you can go visit. So I recommend you do that. Now, we know some bits about the Popham Colony because, again, we had a man on the expedition who kept a journal, and we have parts of it. So we do know some things about at least the first few months of the colony. And we know that the Wawenock visited the colony twice, and these appeared to be diplomatic missions. The first time they visit, there are 40 people from Pemaquid make that paddle 20 miles from Pemaquid to Phippsburg in September, which can be hurricane weather, which is extraordinary. They bring men, women, children with them. I think they're probably fairly curious, but this appears to be a diplomatic mission. And because there are 40 and Samoset was about 17, I'm quite sure that he would have been one of the 40. So, you know, imagine he would have seen this colony under construction, which is amazing. But this is one of those instances where I had to ask myself, after being betrayed by these people and having some of their people kidnapped and taken away, why are they on a diplomatic mission? Why do they want to be friendly with these people? You know, it was really kind of boggling my mind. And then as I kept researching, is like one of those moments where, as I said, not being a historian and not knowing the story, I was putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And sometimes it was really exciting when I figured out it probably had to do with the Micmac War. And this is a war among tribes in Maine, such an important war for the Wabanaki, a very big turning point in their history, I think. And this is a war between the Micmac, as you can see on the map, from Nova Scotia, waging war all down the coast of Maine, which is a pretty impressive feat. That's about 400 miles of paddling for them to get there to wage war. And I won't go into all the details about that, but you know, remember that Samoset's probably around 17 at this point, so he's probably fighting in this war for about 8 years, and it will take its toll, of course. So the Micmac live near that settlement you see marked there as Port Royal, and that is a small French settlement. And that's important because they become very good friends with the French. And when they are about ready to take their armada down the coast, they ask the French to give them something, and that is some guns to wage this war with, which is huge. And the French do, and they teach them how to use them. And they come down the coast of Maine. The first battle takes place at Saco. Those people are completely unsuspecting that they're about to be attacked. The Micmac attack, they're fighting. The Saco warriors fight back. They're actually winning the battle, and that's when the Micmac pull out their secret weapon, which are these guns. And of course, the people of Saco have never seen anything like it. The explosions terrify them, and they manage to kill many of the men. And apparently warfare for indigenous people is not about killing as many as you can. This was very shocking to everyone that they killed 20 men in this battle. And this is just going to change everything, because we know from that journal that was written that the Wawenock were involved in this war. We know that in August, they were involved in a battle in this war. And they've seen the destruction that guns can do. And now they know they need them too. And where else can they get them? But from the English at the Popham Colony. So now the puzzle is beginning to make sense why they would make that trip. And they make 2 diplomatic missions trying to create an alliance with the English. And I think it has to be about the guns. They are looking for support to help them against the Micmac. So it's this case where, they are choosing the lesser of 2 evils, but it's all about their survival. Who can they trust, and what is their best chance of survival? And they decide to throw their lot in with the English. But getting back to the Popham Colony for a minute, the colony is going to fail because they aren't terribly well prepared when they come. They didn't bring enough food with them to get through the whole first year very well. I think they hoped that they would get assistance from the native people. Things are going okay at first, and the local people are helping them. And the president of the colony is treating them well, but then he will die in February. And that's unfortunate because things will begin to unravel at that point. The second in command is a young nobleman who is, frankly, he's racist, and he starts to mistreat the Wabanaki, who then begin to withhold help. And it's really a more complicated story than that, but that's sort of the short version. So for many reasons, they decide to pack up the next year and go home, and the Popham Colony is a failure as a result. And I think, obviously, I think the Wabanaki are happy to see them go, even though they're wishing they could get those weapons from them. But of course, we know that's not the end of the English people coming to New England, or else that would be the end of this story. They come back, and they come back very soon. However, they switch their focus from building a colony. They recognize that that's not going to work. The winter had been so frigid and awful that it became known in England that Maine was just too cold a place to build a settlement. So they switched their focus to fishing, because we have great fishing here, and they know they can make money at fishing. So that's what they do. Probably as soon as the next year, maybe 1609, they are sending fishing boats here, and every year there are more and more fishing boats. They're fishing out of New Harbor, they're fishing off of Monhegan Island, they're fishing off Damascove Island, and the Wawenock seem to tolerate them as long as they weren't trying to settle in the area. I think they probably just came for 2 or 3 months for the fishing season. They were probably sleeping aboard their ships, and were just coming on shore to dry their fish, like you see here on this fish drying rack. They would have needed to replenish their water and their wood, and maybe do some hunting. But they were also very interested in trading. Now, trading will become a big deal because they're looking for beaver furs. And beaver furs are popular because beaver fur can be felted and made into a hat. And beaver felt hats were all the rage in Europe. Royalty wore them, man on the street wore them. And they were so popular that they just about, overhunted their beaver in Europe. They were importing them from Russia, I think, at that point. So when these fishermen came to New England and they saw the native people wearing beaver furs, they were excited because they knew they could make money doing some trading on the side, which they did. So this is when Samoset would have really gotten to know the English fishermen. He was getting familiar with them. And this is when he would have learned to speak English. That's why a lot of people think that he was kidnapped and taken to England because he knew English, but he tells the settlers in Plymouth that he learned from the fishermen, and this is when he would have learned that. So, but unfortunately, you probably know this part of the story, that closeness with Europeans will come at a huge cost to indigenous people, and that will be in diseases. We don't know what caused the great dying of 1616 to 1619. It could have been more than one disease, but it was so horrible. It's really unimaginable, even though we've been living through a pandemic. And, I think back to the beginning and how scary it was when we didn't know what caused it and we didn't know how it was spread and we didn't have treatments for it. And I think of indigenous people who wouldn't have known any of those things either. I mean, they had never seen this before and they wouldn't know how to deal with it. But even so, I mean, the COVID-19 death rate has never been even 4%. And it's thought that along the coast of Maine, people were dying at a rate of 75 to 80%, which is unbelievable, really. And yet they looked around and the Europeans were not getting sick. And so I think about the psychological power that would have given them over the native people who somehow thought they had angered their great spirit and were being punished for some reason. Now, all that death, just, that trauma and that fear it's hard to imagine. But then there would have been such a cultural loss with all of that, all of those people taking their wisdom with them when they died too. And you had the Christian Europeans who like to exploit this tragedy by telling native people that, yes, we're Christians, we believe in God, and God is punishing you if you're not Christian. And so there's a lot of power struggle there, I think, that we need to consider. And this would have been sort of the beginning of a lot of displacement, I think, of indigenous people, a lot of movement around as people maybe didn't have enough survivors left in their village and they needed to go and live in another village. So you just see a lot of movement. And it's also a time, I think, we have to begin to think about this upset in the balance of power, because until this point, I think indigenous people were on equal footing or more than equal footing with the English. But if you take Pemaquid, for example, of 100 people, if 80% of them die, you've got 20 survivors. How many of those are adult men that can protect the village? Maybe 5 if you're lucky. So with 5 men protecting the village, and yet you've got these fishing ships coming to your shores with many men aboard, now you're outnumbered. And this is truly going to affect all of the decisions that they will make. And so for generations, really, until they can rebound their population. And so what a tragic time. And this was, we think, the time that Samoset became Sagamore of Pemaquid. A really difficult time. He certainly had a lot to deal with, which is why it seems like a really extraordinary time for him to go to Plymouth. And yet this is when he goes. He leaves for Plymouth in 1620, just as this is subsiding. So, when I realized the timing of his trip, I thought, my God, why would he leave his people? And this was such an extraordinary thing to do, and he must have had an extraordinary reason for going. And I have a theory about that, which I will share. But we finally get to Plymouth, the thing that Samoset is most known for. But as you can see, his life to this point has already been really rather extraordinary. So why do we think Samoset went to Plymouth in the first place? I think the connection must be with Tisquantum, who we grew up knowing as Squanto, who was a Wampanoag. Tisquantum lived in the village of Patuxet, one of the Wampanoag villages, which is where the Plymouth settlers will live and rename it Plymouth. So Tisquantum was kidnapped by some English explorers. He was taken first to Spain, then to England, where he learned to speak very good English. He lived there for years. Eventually, he got the opportunity to come back to North America. There was a little settlement in Newfoundland, I think. And he got the opportunity to come back, which he grabbed to be an interpreter there. And when he was there, he met an English captain named Thomas Dermer. And he convinced Thomas Dermer that Patuxet was the most wonderful place on earth and that Dermer ought to take him home. And Dermer thinks this is a great idea. Sounds like a wonderful place. And so they make their way south, but they stop on Monhegan Island. And they're there at least twice. And to me, that's an incredible coincidence, because the Wawenock would have been paddling out to these islands to trade with the fishermen. 12 miles offshore, the island of Monhegan is not an easy ride. If you've ever taken a ferry out there, it gets pretty bumpy. But they would do that in their canoes, which is incredible, just to trade and to fish. I'm sure they were fishing out there too. So I think Tisquantum is the reason why he went. But also, growing up, thinking of Samoset walking into Plymouth, I think I always thought of him as that, just like it's a jaunty stroll into the plantation, and he's smiling and he's laughing and he's waving. I had completely the wrong image of what that walk into the plantation really was, because it was nothing like that. It really was an incredibly tense and dangerous moment. It was threatening to his life. And he was well aware of this. And I'll get to that in just a sec. He very well knew that his life was in danger by walking into Plymouth Plantation. So why was Samoset the one to walk into that plantation? I think because it makes sense that either he or Tisquantum were the logical choices, because they spoke English. Tisquantum's English was a lot better, so he was probably more valuable. And they wouldn't want to lose him. And also he was Wampanoag and Samoset was not. Samoset was an outsider. So maybe that's why he was sent in. Maybe he was forced to go. We don't know. Maybe he volunteered. We don't know. But one thing you don't see in this illustration is he walked in with a bow and 2 arrows. So he actually was armed when he walked in. Now I want to highlight this quote from William Bradford, who will become the governor of Plymouth, where he talks about the danger from the savages, and there's that word again, who are cruel, barbarous, and treacherous, furious in their rage, and merciless when they get the upper hand. Not content to kill, they delight in tormenting people in the most bloody manner possible. And he goes on from there to call them cannibals, and he just goes into a great description of how violent they are. Now, we have no evidence that the Wawenock were cannibals. They weren't. But this was the rumor in Europe. So this is what the settlers who are going to come to Plymouth, this is what they think they are walking into. They think that all the indigenous people in the Americas are cruel, barbarous savages. That makes me think either they're very brave or foolish for coming. I'm going to give them credit for being very brave. But this is what they thought. Now, the first encounter that they will have with indigenous people is out on Outer Cape Cod. That's where they first make land. This will kind of verify what they think, because it will be a violent encounter that they will have. In the scouting party on shore, the men are tromping around. They spend the night, and they wake up in the morning and they're attacked by the local people. They're being shot at by arrows. They respond by shooting their guns at them. No one's actually killed in what they call the first encounter. But it makes them think that these people are very violent. It kind of corroborates what they already thought. Now, what we don't get in our history books is that these were the Nauset who lived on Cape Cod, and they had a very good reason for attacking the English. And that's because 6 years prior to this, an English boat had come to their shores. The English had pretended friendship, traded with them, and then kidnapped several of their people who were never seen again. And, the Nauset are not going to let that happen again. And I think they were just trying to scare them off. I mean, I think if they wanted to kill them, they really could have easily done that, but they really are just scaring them away, which they're successful at. The settlers leave, and that's when they head over to Plymouth. And they will find a location that obviously had been lived at by native people, but it's completely abandoned by now, and that's Patuxent. So, you know, you've got them arriving in Plymouth. This is December. It's so late in the season, a really hard time to start building your homes. The weather's terrible, and they are all really sick. Out of 102 colonists, I think exactly half will die that winter, which is more trauma for them. I mean, what a hard winter they had. They were sick from diseases, probably pneumonia, exposure, malnutrition. And all winter long, they knew they were surrounded by native people. They knew there were people around them. They could see their fires. They could sometimes hear them in the woods, though they were never, ever approached all winter long, which made them feel they were really anxious. And I think the Wampanoag are probably watching them, wondering what they're doing, because this would have been the first time they would have seen women and children on their shores. So this is a different situation than they'd ever seen before. And what are those people doing there? But the settlers were so anxious that they would bury their dead in the middle of the night in unmarked graves. They didn't want the native people to see how many of them were dying. So that's the background that we have for Samoset's walk into the plantation. March 16, 1621, he walks into their settlement all by himself with that bow and those arrows, and surprises these settlers. And boldly, as they describe, walks right down the middle of their village, right toward a group of men who are standing together with their muskets. And I don't know about you, but I think if I were a man thinking that a cannibal had just walked into my settlement and I had a gun in my hand, I think I might shoot first. But Samoset is very aware of the situation. He knows about that encounter between the Nauset and the colonists. Word gets around. So he was aware how dangerous this was. He knew that if they were surprised, they might shoot. But he acts quickly. He does wave his hand, he smiles, and he quickly speaks to them in English. It says, "Welcome." And I'm sure that the shock saved his life. I mean, really. It must have been such a surprise when they were expecting some uncivilized savage. And yet he was so far from that. According to the two accounts that we have from William Bradford and the others probably from Edward Winslow, we understand that Samoset spends a whole afternoon talking with these people. They are anxious to learn about the area and the people that are around them. He absolutely answers them freely. He doesn't hold back. He tells them what they want to know. He tells them about the Patuxent and how badly they were affected by the epidemic and how most of them had died. He tells them he's from Monhegan, which is interesting, rather than Pemaquid, because Monhegan was so well known to English people. He knew they would recognize the name. And then he starts to name drop, which I think is so fun. He starts telling them all the names of all the sea captains he knows. And, you know, he's dropping names and he knows these important people in England. He knows their names anyway, because Tohono and Skikoweros, who were the two that came back to Pemaquid, knew about these people. And so he's dropping these names and he knows this is going to impress them. So after several hours, he asks for beer, and then he eats their food, and he seems perfectly at home with these people. And then that night, as dark is coming, they want to get rid of him, which you can understand. I mean, they don't really want to spend the night with a savage. And so they try to get him to leave. And I love this detail. He won't leave. He refuses to leave. And I love that, because by doing that, he is showing them that he is going to be treated like an equal, right? So he insists on spending the night. So they end up putting him up in one of their houses with an armed guard all night. They are still anxious. So anyway, he wakes up the next morning and he does agree to leave, but he tells them he'll come back and bring some of the Wampanoag with him. Now, Samoset he's on a mission here. He is laying the groundwork for a relationship to take place between the Wampanoag and the English. He's establishing trust. He's showing them how civilized the native people really are. He's it's a diplomatic mission through and through, and he's the perfect man for it because he's had so much interaction with English people. Now they ask him to do two things. They ask him that when he comes back to leave, to have him and the Wampanoag leave their weapons outside the settlement. And the other thing they ask is for the Wampanoag to return some tools that the settlers left out in the woods. They left them in the woods and the Wampanoag had taken them. So they asked Samoset to bring them back. So when he comes back the next day, he does both of those things. So he's showing them how responsible he is, and by extension, Indigenous people are. So I think they have to adjust their perception of Native people, thanks to Samoset. Now, part of his mission is to bring these people together. And I think that's probably at the direction of Usamiquin, who we know as Massasoit. He is the great sachem of the Wampanoag. Massasoit's actually the title. That means great sachem. And then when the Wampanoag called him Massasoit, the settlers just assumed that was his name. So anyway, his name was actually Usamiquin. And Samoset brings these two parties together with the intention of signing a treaty together. They've never met, but their first meeting is going to result in a treaty, which is extraordinary to think that he has done the diplomatic work on both ends to make this happen. So they do. They come together. They sign this treaty. They agree that they will be friendly with one another and that they will come to each other's assistance if they need to, if they're attacked by an enemy. And again, I had to ask myself, why did the Wampanoag want to be friends? Well, they're in the same position that the Wawenock had been, in that they were badly decimated by the epidemic, yet their neighbors who were their enemies were the Narragansett, and they weren't touched by the epidemic. So they are in a very vulnerable position. And Usamiquin is, weighing his options and realizing that it's probably best that he makes an alliance with these people first, and they have these powerful weapons that will be useful to them. So it's a calculation for their survival. And Samoset has made that happen. So I just want to leave that with you to make sure you know about where he was at Plymouth. But we don't hear more about Samoset after this treaty, because I think he then leaves for Maine. And here's my theory about why he may have gone there in the first place. And that is, the next time we're going to meet Samoset in the historical record will be in 1623. And we find out that he has a wife and a baby son. And that makes me think that he probably went where there was a higher population looking for a wife. And perhaps more people to help him repopulate Pemaquid, because, their population was so nearly wiped out. So that's my theory. Anyway, so he goes back to Maine to help his people recover from the epidemic, the war. And when he gets back to Maine, he's got to deal with some rather unsavory characters. I think it's fair to call them pirates, because that's essentially what they were. These are traders who came to the coast of Maine. They're very far from home. There's no law and order here, so they can basically do what they like. And they are really interested in trading for furs and skins. And the Wabanaki also are very interested in trade. They have come to really like some of these trade goods that they've gotten used to. Metal goods, which they don't have, like knives and axes and shovels. And the women really like copper kettles to cook in, because they were using ceramic pots, which were more prone to break. So they're getting to like these items, but also I am sure that they are looking for weapons, swords and guns and ammunition. And it begins to really very quickly change their lives and their lifestyle. The men are spending a lot more of their time hunting and trapping to get these skins and furs. The women are the ones who process those hides. So they're spending a lot more of their time, instead of producing their own or getting their own food, now in this market economy where they're trading. And it's so interesting, because it isn't very many years until they're actually trading for corn, which is mind-boggling that they're not growing it, but they're trading for it. So that just shows you how much their lives are changing. And some of these traders were not such great people. They were cheated a lot by some of these traders, and then some of them were downright violent. And in fact, we know that Samoset had a run-in with the pirate in Casco Bay. And the fact that he's in Casco Bay is interesting because you can see how far and wide he is going from Pemaquid to trade for the goods that he wants. That's a long way to go in a canoe, and that he is there to do trading. And we know this because there's an English explorer named Christopher Levitt who comes to Maine in 1623, and he's there to set up a colony. He's been granted 6,000 acres, which he can put anywhere on the coast that he wants. So he's going up and down the coast to find a place to build his little settlement. And he meets Samoset, and he writes about him, which is so exciting to me. So he's the one who writes about this encounter that Samoset has with the pirate. And what happens is Samoset is in Casco Bay. The pirate stops him, tells them that Samoset has to trade with him and him alone. And Samoset says, oh no, I'm only going to trade with my good friend Levitt, and I'm not going to trade with you. And the pirate's not having it. They start calling each other names, and everything escalates. And then they attack and beat Samoset up. He is attacked by pirates. Samoset survives that and then goes back to Levitt and describes this encounter with, and that's how we know about it. And it's just one of these instances where you can see Samoset's passion, and it's wonderful. He goes on a tirade. He tells Levitt, I am going to go out and I'm going to kill the first English fisherman I see. And then I'm going to England and I'm going to complain to King James about this. It's wonderful. But then when he starts to calm down, he starts to really backpedal. And then he apologizes to Levitt for what he said, which really shows you this imbalance of power at this point, because the pirate had 17 cannons on his ships and 50 men all armed with muskets. And he totally outgunned and outmanned Samoset and the Wawenock. There's no way that Samoset could fight against that. So he had to hope that Christopher Levitt could, administer justice for him. But poor Levitt didn't have the manpower either, and he was just as bad a position. And so it's a case where, they can't take care of this issue on their own, and the English don't provide justice, and it's a shame. And it will kind of, they'll have long memories of some of these mistreatments. And I know I'm probably, getting close to my end of time, and we are almost there. So if you can hang on, I don't want you to think that all the people coming to the coast of Maine were evil pirates. They were not. So, as early as the mid-1620s, you've got settlers who are coming. And these are people who bring their families and just want to farm the land and live among the native people. John Brown is famous for coming to New Harbor in the Pemaquid area. And he brought his wife, Margaret, with him. And he may have had 2 children already by that time. So this would have been a new thing for the Wawenock to see families arrive. And I like to think of the Wawenock women having a chance to finally meet a European woman, and how that would have been interesting to them. They probably swarmed her with, they wanted to see what she looked like and how she dressed and how she cooked and everything. But John Brown is notorious or famous for supposedly signing a deed with Samoset and another sagamore in 1625 and purchasing the whole Pemaquid Peninsula from Samoset. That deed is thought very much to be a forgery. And after looking at it, I would totally agree with that. But, I think Samoset was friendly with John Brown. I think he welcomed him to the area. He had no reason really not to. There were lots of resources. There were very few settlers coming to Maine at that time. I think he looked at it as sharing the land with John Brown. The indigenous people, of course, had a very different idea of land ownership than Europeans did. They thought of themselves as belonging to the land, not the land belonging to them. Different way of looking at it, like they didn't think they owned the sky either. So, but they had their territories that they lived in and obtained food from, and those were very important to them. So, if Samoset really, if this was an authentic deed, Samoset would be the first indigenous person to have sold land to Europeans, which is pretty amazing. However, I mean, that was a whole year before the Lenape will buy Manhattan from the Dutch. And there's just so many red flags around that deed. I really do feel that it's a forgery. I don't think he ought to be saddled with that fame. But he did go on and sign 3 more deeds, and those aren't thought to be forgeries. And I just have to show you that in the last deed that he will sign, he leaves us this gift, which is his signature, which is a bow and arrow. That old hunter, that old warrior signed his name with a bow and arrow. And it's just, it's not just take your breath away to see that. It did for me. Feels like he's reaching out through time to us. Now, as we get near the end of Samoset's life, the next few decades will be very, very difficult for the Wabanaki. And, they will blame Europeans for their troubles, which is sort of justified because they wouldn't have had these problems without Europeans being here. So there will be another epidemic that will burn through New England. We know it's smallpox that time, and what a horrible disease that was. Killed so many people. Those who survived would be horribly scarred. Sometimes it caused blindness, so it was just devastating. And then already by the 1640s, they are overhunting their animals. And it's getting harder and harder for them to find the animals that they now need to sustain them, because this is the lifestyle that they have really embraced. These people who have lived sustainably for thousands of years are now hunting the animals nearly to extinction, and it's devastating. And then you have the problem of alcohol, which is such a shame. There was no alcohol before Europeans, and Europeans tended to really, really push alcohol on Native people. It was a way to manipulate them. If you get people drinking, then you can cheat them when you're trading, or you can maybe get them to sign over land to you. So it was just another weapon against them. These frustrations will just simmer and simmer under the surface, and will always be there. Now, Samoset probably died around 1653. He signed 2 deeds that year. And maybe it's a blessing that he died before things would turn even worse for Wabanaki people. Legend has it that he's buried out on Louds Island. We don't know for sure, but it's certainly, that's where he's buried. Now, just as I finish this up, after his death, things will really take a bad turn. Those same resentments of being so mistreated by the English, cheated, not getting justice from them, being treated as inferior, it's just, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. And they finally regain their strength because they regain their numbers once they rebound from the epidemics. And they get help from the French. The French will come in and fight in these wars alongside them. So they gain strength. They will actually win those first 2 wars, King Philip's War, which starts in 1675. They will drive the English almost completely out of Maine during those first 2 wars. And they will burn the English settlements of Pemaquid to the ground twice, once in each war. But there are just too many English coming to New England, and they cannot withstand the onslaught of so many people and such concerted effort to drive them off the land. And that map it really shows you the movement of English moving the Abenaki off English territory. And it shows you the difference between where the tribes that exist on their homelands today were living in French territory, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, Micmac, and Penobscot, and why they still live on at least part of their homelands. But because they were, the English weren't happy with the land. And they did it through a policy of genocide, which was something I didn't even know and is not included in the book that I wrote because I hadn't learned it yet. And I was just really shocked by this. Over the course of all those wars, there were at least 79 bounty proclamations on Wabanaki people from the Massachusetts government, which we were part of. And these were scalp bounties. So the government of Massachusetts was promising to pay a lot of money if people would just go out and kill or capture Wabanaki. This proclamation from 1755 is from the French and Indian War, and the Wawenock are one of the tribes specifically named in this proclamation, so we know they were targeted. And in that proclamation, the English are offering, I think, 50 pounds for a live man captive and 40 pounds for his scalp. That 50 pounds was about $10,000 back then. And they would have had to transport their captives all the way to Boston to collect. So it was probably a lot easier just to take the scalp and bring that to Boston. You wouldn't have to bring a live captive. And there's a bounty on the heads of women and children under the age of 12, 25 pounds. So that just gives you some idea of what life was like. And even that wasn't enough. It was, you know, they were sending their armies up here. They would destroy villages and crops and boats and anything just to make it impossible to live on the land. And this short film called Bounty is really a moving look. The Penobscot are teaching their children this history. So they take their children to Boston where these nations originated, and they tell them about them. And it's a hard history to hear. And, you know, but it's important. And I just want to finish up by saying, I know it's painful, but I grew up not knowing any of this history and being oblivious to the Wawenock and what they lived through. And in my own personal case, I feel that's a real shame. I think I would have wanted to know. And I think that the only way that we can move forward together with Wabanaki is that we all know the story. And I had promised to tell you why Samoset's story was important. And hopefully you can see that looking at his life and what he endured, and what the Wawenock endured, was really the same story that played out all across this country. I mean, it was the same story over and over and over of, you know, the mistreatment, the cheating, you know, the broken treaties, being treated as inferior over and over. And then, you know, obviously the conflicts. So Samoset's story is really not unique. And I would just say that I think Wabanaki people would want you to know that they, even in the face of trying to annihilate them, they've survived. There are probably Wawenock descendants living in Canada and also among the other Wabanaki tribes. So there are descendants today. And they've always been here. They're still here. They're trying to regain their culture, their languages, trying to gain respect that they deserve. And they're also trying to gain their sovereignty, which I'm sure you've heard all about. And I'll just finish by saying we can all help them do that. And if you do want to learn more, I wrote a book and you can read more, but you can also go to my website. And if we don't have time for all your questions, and I hope you bring me some questions, you can message me through my website. And thank you so much for those of you who are still here. Well done. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I feel like I have to watch the recording now because there was so much information that I want to make sure that I retain it all. So I will be going back to watch the recording. I also mentioned that because I know a few people were having trouble with the connection, so they were getting kicked out and back in. We will have this available by recording. It was so rich with information. All right, time for questions. I've had a few questions come in through the chat, and I'll just start firing them off if you're ready. One person, this is a straightforward one, but you had shown a Massasoit monument. Where is that located?
Plymouth, yeah.
Plymouth, okay, thank you.
Or Usamiquin or Massasoit in Plymouth, which I have actually seen that one. I have not, but I need to go make another trip to Plymouth, obviously. Got more things to see. There's a Samoset Road in Plymouth too.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, back to the part of your presentation where you spoke about the Micmac War. one person is asking, what were they hoping to get out of their war? Do you know, what did the Micmac need more of that they didn't have in Nova Scotia, or do you know what their general goals were?
Yeah, apparently there's been a long history of Micmac raids down the coast of Maine. Because as I said, it's the Little Ice Age, and they're not really able to grow crops up there because the growing season was too short. And so they were coming down to raid for corn and food like that. They obviously had animals that they could hunt, but they were interested in those sorts of crops. So apparently they were doing that, and I think they were constantly raiding for foodstuffs
Sure.
that they didn't have in their diet. Um, and wars tend to be about disagreements and retaliation. They felt they had been insulted by the people of Saco. They had come down, a couple of years before that. Anyway, it's kind of a long story to do it on a trade mission, and they felt that they didn't receive appropriate trade goods in return. And, these things happen, and then somebody gets killed and there's a retaliation, and then it blows up into a full-on war. But, I think that the raids began with the idea of getting food.
And then snowballed from there. That certainly makes sense. Okay, another person mentions that they were related to John Brown and asks, were you aware of interactions of Samoset with William Hilton? Now, William Hilton's not a name that I know, but perhaps you do.
Hilton, isn't that one of John Brown's, could be one of John Brown's son-in-laws or grandson-in-laws? Yeah, there's a, I'm terrible, terrible, terrible with names, and I hate to say that, but it's true. Yeah, I mean, Samoset will be friendly with John Brown's family for generations. And the land that he sells is to John Brown's, first to John Brown's son-in-law, and then I think another grandson-in-law. So there's a connection with the John Brown family. John Brown will actually move away. He buys land in Sheepscot or Woolwich, I think, and then he moves to Damascotta. So he's around, but his family stays in like the Round Pond area and on the peninsula, and Samoset stays friends with them. Yeah, and
So the connection is wider than just that one-on-one.
oh yeah, he's, and I think that he ends up. That's why I think people think he may be buried on Louds Island, because one of John Brown's family members lived out on Louds Island. So
Oh, interesting. Okay. That actually is a great segue, because there's another question here about what we know about that tradition that maybe he's buried there, and if you know about the burial traditions of Samoset's
we do know a little bit.
Samoset's culture.
Yeah, I mean, we know a little bit, because actually there have been a couple of graves found at Pemaquid. So we know some of the burial goods that were buried with bodies. There was a skeleton that was disinterred, and the person had a lock of hair on their chest. There was like a sheet of copper over the person's chest, which I think would have been like, one of the grave goods, was considered, a really important thing to have. So we know little bits, and we know from other tribes near the Wawenock, things like they would have blackened themselves with ash when somebody died. And it was a tradition not to say their name. And it's a really interesting tradition. And it was said that it was raising the tree too soon to use their revered person's name after they passed. And this will become a problem. And so I think one of the reasons why King Philip's War really gets sparked, because when Usamiquin dies and the English use his name, that really makes the Wampanoag upset that they would use his name. So, I mean, there are some traditions, and we know little bits from the burials that were there and from other traditions nearby. But Louds Island, we know there was a burial ground there because after a hurricane, some coastline was washed away and a whole lot of burial goods were found. But don't know if Samoset was there.
Thanks for commenting on that. I'm just going to charge ahead because there are so many questions, but could you comment on the conflict? Oh, this is a two-part question. Could you comment on the conflict between the Catholic French and the Protestant English using Native Americans as their fighters? That's the hard part of the question. The easy part is, are you related to Ted and Ray?
In-laws. There's probably somebody from Wisconsin here.
It's somebody from all the anyway. The part about the Catholic French and the Protestant English using the Native Americans.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a huge question and huge story. Always conflict between Catholics and Protestants. And sometimes that would be within a country, like within England, that, you know, the Catholics and Protestants within England would fight each other. And then, you know, inter countries because they had, you know, different religions. So it was incessant that, you know, Catholics and Protestants didn't get along. So then you, of course, you do have the French who are coming really are generally all Catholic. And you have all these Jesuit priests that live up along the St. Lawrence, and they are trying to start these little communities. And then, you know, you have that sort of a dividing line, and you have all these Protestants living in English territory. But what's interesting about Maine is there wasn't really a lot of conflicts because of religion in Maine itself, because there were so few settlers really in early days. They weren't terribly much bumping up against each other. And in Maine, you had the issue of there being so few people, and this really being considered the wild frontier, that we couldn't even attract any clergymen to want to work here. So it was kind of considered this lawless place of no religion, you know? So it is really interesting from that point of view. But the Wabanaki will very much gravitate towards the French and the religion because the Jesuit priests actually tried to help them wean themselves off alcohol. And they really wanted that. They really wanted that. And that was the only place of sanctuary, the only place where they saw any help. And it would become a real strong bond, and they would bond with each other. And as I said, fight wars on the same side. I don't know if that answers that question.
Yeah, well, I have a feeling that you could probably answer that question for a long time, but that gets to it. So thank you very much. Somebody else is wondering if you've connected with the Abenaki at Wawenock and Wawenock in Quebec.
Yes, I keep trying.
Okay.
We think that mostly the Wawenock ended up in a little reserve. There were two reserves that were created by the Jesuits for the Abenaki refugees, Wawenock and Wawenock. And it's thought that most of the Wawenock ended up in Wawenock. And I need to go there. I mean, I was writing this book in the pandemic, so the border was closed and I couldn't go there. But I was calling and writing and sending letters, and I sent them a copy of the book, and I've never been able to make a connection. And I so much want to do that. I so much want to. And I've tried a few people who are familiar with Wawenock, and it can be just really hard to make those connections with Native people when you're not Native yourself. I mean, they have no reason to know who I am, and I will keep trying. I think I'm going to make a trip north and see if I'm face to face, if I can make that connection. But I would so love to meet some of the Wawenock descendants. That would be such a thrill.
I can see why you would. Do you have any plans to translate into French? The same person is wondering.
Oh, my French is not good enough. That must be Kathy. Kathy, did you ask that question? A friend of mine, we spent minutes together, and I can see her on the screen. I think my French is good enough.
Jody, your French was always perfect. Yes. Yes.
All right, Jody, I have another question that I think this is a really fantastic question and maybe a good place to end for today, given that we're getting close on time, but it does get to sort of a relevant issue that we're dealing with now. But somebody asks, why do you think the language on the monument in New Harbor may not be respectful to Samoset?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know the monuments, that's a very touchy subject. People don't like to see any changes. And to me, it does feel really disrespectful to him because the language is kind of, it almost makes Samoset sound like a very naive person who just walks into Plymouth. It doesn't really say anything more than that, so you don't get any context of that walk into Plymouth. But then it really talks a lot about how he so nicely hands over this land to John Brown. And what a good thing that was. Well, I think if you're an Indigenous person, that's really not the thing you would ever want to be known for, is to be the first person to sell your land off to Europeans. And I don't think that he deserves that title anyway, given that I think that that land deed is a forgery. So, I mean, there's the issue of the deed, which is what's really highlighted on that monument. And I don't think that it gives you a picture of what his life was like really at all. You don't get any of the hardship. You don't get any of his personality. To me, it's a glorification of the English settlers more than of him.
So perhaps it doesn't really tell the story from his perspective at all. And
yeah, and we've talked to people about this monument, and I think people would want us to add to the narrative and not take anything away. So I think that's where we are in the process. I think we can tell more of the story, and but I think people need to see a fuller picture here.
I like the way you put that we can tell more of the story. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe when that monument went up, we didn't have as much insight as we might have today. Jody, thank you very much. I think we're coming to the end of our time together. I want to thank you. I want to thank the over 110 people who joined us for this talk, and probably another 100 who will watch it on YouTube later, starting next week. Check out Jody's book. It is available where locally, Jody?
The local bookshops, Sherman's carries it. You can get it online too. But shop at your local bookstore. Ask them to order it for you. That'd be great.
Awesome.
Get it from the local library too. As a librarian, I tell you.
Oh, I love that. All right, thank you, everyone. If I didn't have an opportunity to get to your question and it's still kind of burning in your mind, I think I got through most of them, but I know that Jody's put up the information here for getting to our website. You could also email me directly and we'll connect you with the answers that you might be looking for. But for this evening, thank you, everyone. Both go have a nice night and come back and see us next Thursday when we take a look at a whole different topic, printmaking in early America.
Thank you for the great program.